Hello, welcome to Cognitations, a podcast where we interview cognitive scientists about their work and how it can help us answer all of our questions about the mind. Cognitive science is the interdisciplinary study of the mind and comprises domains such as the neurosciences, cognitive psychology, linguistics, philosophy, computer science, and more. Without further ado, let's jump into today's episode.
Cool. Hello and welcome to Cognitations. We are today's hosts. I'm Tanai.
And I'm Jay.
Religion is a puzzling phenomenon. On the one hand, it has been a major historical motto, shaping civilizations and guiding billions of lives. On the other hand, the core of religion centers around beings and realms that we simply cannot see, touch, or measure. One might then wonder, how can religious beliefs be both more important to us than ordinary beliefs and more removed from what we can know to be the case? In his recent book, Religion as Make-Believe, Neil van Leeuwen offers a provocative answer. That is, religious beliefs have this puzzling aspect because they are, in reality, a kind of imagining, not so different from that which guides children's play. Welcome to the show, Neil.
Hey, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's get into it. So reading the book, it feels like it comes from a very passionate, one could also say even a personal place. So how did you initially come up with this idea that religious believing is actually a kind of imagining?
Well, there are two streams to it. One, like you say, it's very personal, and then the other is kind of technical, philosophical. I'll start with the personal one. So I grew up in the Christian Reformed Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and that's, a lot of people say, is the Jerusalem, so to speak, of the Christian Reformed Church, right? It's the center of everything. And my parents taught at Calvin College, which is a small liberal arts college that's Christian. And I went to church basically 3 times a week, twice on Sunday and once on Wednesday. And even as a child, I kind of had the sense that people would be very serious about their religion on Sundays and then when they're in church, and then seem to kind of forget about it the rest of the week, and then, act as if God wasn't even a thing a lot of the time in terms of their interactions with other people and so on. So that always puzzled me and really got me interested in the set of topics in philosophy of mind that I got into. And so I was writing my PhD thesis, this is, fast forward a bunch of years, on the topic of self-deception and what belief is. And, I was theorizing what it is for someone to lie to themselves, kind of with this religious material in the background. But one of the problems that I addressed in my PhD thesis was this problem that David Hume raised of distinguishing believing something from imagining it, right? Or treating something as fiction. So just to get an idea of the problem, maybe everyone in the audience can imagine that there's a monkey running around their kitchen. All right. So in that case, you have an imagining or imaginative representation of a monkey running around your kitchen, right? We can all do it. But you don't believe that. But how is that different from believing, from taking it to be matter of fact the case that there's a monkey running around your kitchen? And this is a difference in attitude type or the way you relate to the ideas. Okay. So as part of my dissertation, I was coming up with a theory that would distinguish ordinary factual belief from imagining ideas. And you can't do that by appeal to the content, because like Hume said, for anything you can represent, you can imagine it, right? Or you can potentially believe it. Okay. So I came up with a theory of that difference. And I was just lying in bed one morning during my postdoc at Tufts University, and it hit me. A lot of the so-called religious beliefs in the minds of people that I grew up with, it seems like they operate more like the imaginings than like mundane, ordinary factual beliefs that guide your action in an instrumental way in the everyday world. I'm talking about beliefs like about where your address is, where your office is, where the grocery is, what's in your cupboard. Okay. This is your basic model of the world. And then it's like there's a 2-map cognitive structure when you imagine. You can imagine a chair. You can factually believe there's a chair there, and you can imagine that there's a wizard in the chair. Well, it started to seem to me, just reflecting on my own personal experience, that a lot of religious attitudes were like this. Okay. So something bad happens to your car, and you might imagine that a demon caused that. But
Hmm.
that doesn't guide your action in the same sort of way as your belief that the spark plug blew or something like that. So it was really out of kind of reflection on this technical distinction, or the technical details. It's an intuitive distinction, but the details of the distinction are technical. Reflection on that combined with my experience growing up that led me to this position that religion is a kind of make believe, or at least qualifiers. Lots and lots of religious belief and practice come down to a form of imaginative make believe, albeit a sacralized one.
So maybe we have to get a tiny bit more into the technical details, or at least because you mentioned the difference between attitude types and content. Can you kind of
hmm
make this distinction a bit more vivid, let's say, for the listeners?
Yeah, so it's actually something that everyone is intuitively familiar with, but maybe not that terminology. So a content is just the idea that you represent. Now, think about it like this. You can factually believe that it's going to rain tomorrow. You can suspect that it's going to rain tomorrow. You can assume for the sake of argument that it's going to rain tomorrow. You can imagine for make believe play that it's going to rain tomorrow. So the content there is that it's going to rain tomorrow. That's what you
Hmm.
represent as being the case. So that's the content. And the attitude is how you relate to that content. Do you relate it to it in an imaginative way, in a factually believing way, in a hypothesizing way, in an assuming just to be safe kind of way, right? So we always, maybe just if it's a rainy time of year, you assume just to be safe that it's going to rain tomorrow, and then you plan your event inside. So those are all different attitudes or ways of relating to the same content. All right. So that allows us to say, well, in the case of religious so-called belief, how are people relating to their ideas? All right. So that's really the focus, right? So a lot of philosophers focus on contents of religious belief. Oh, is it about God? Is it about the supernatural? Is it about morality or something like that? My focus, maybe one of the big contributions, if I may, is to say, hey, look, we just need to stop being naive about the world believe and say what's actually going on in terms of a different way of relating to content. Okay. So that's the real kind of crux of the problem space of the book.
So, as we're still on the space of terminology, you also dropped a few other terms like make believe,
hmm
imagination, and in the book as well, you use terms like religious credence, or credence, and how that's different from belief. Maybe if we could also touch upon these terms and how you see distinctions between them and how you define them, that might be useful before we get into the weeds of your argument.
Yeah. I think this is a good place to help get an intuitive feel of what the view is. So think of the following kind of case. You're at a playground and you see kids playing games of make believe. So some kids are playing with GI Joe toys. All right. I don't. Do you have GI Joe in the UK? Yeah. All right. Good. Good.
I mean, pretty
This.
much, the US managed to globalize
Yeah,
this commodity.
American colonialist capitalism has British kids playing with GI Joe. Great. Okay. So, but some kids will play with those. Other kids will play with Barbie toys. Well, I'm realizing how US centric my examples are. Other kids will play with He-Man. All right. And so they form groups around which super powerful imagined agent that they're playing these games with. Okay. And so if you're having in groups formed around this, and I haven't defined it yet, but sort of make believe play, that shows that what we imagine can be powerful in constituting our group identities. All right. So when children or adults, because adults play make believe as well, just not as obviously so, but with acting, and then also in everyday life, there are little games of make believe we play. Um, that shows that the imaginings that guide our make believe play can help constitute our group identities. So when I say imaginings, I mean you take an imaginative attitude to the idea, say that the G.I. Joe toy can talk. Okay. So you have one layer of factual belief. All right. The child has one layer of factual belief. The child knows, or I would say factually believes, that this doll can't talk. And that's why the child makes the voices, right? Says, go away, Cobra. I will defeat you, right? Or whatever. But at the same time, there's another layer of representation according to which this is a being that actually can talk. So when a child makes a voice for, say, a G.I. Joe doll, there's a layer of factual belief and there's a layer of imagining, and both are implicated in guiding the same action. All right. So that's what I call a two-map cognitive structure. So we have psychological states guiding behavior. And in order to make sense of the behavior, there has to be kind of two maps at the same time. The child lives in a double world. There's a pile of sand. There's also a fortress. All right. There's a plastic toy. There's also a super powerful agent. And the suggestion of the book is that in religious contexts, there's also a two-map cognitive structure. And on the one hand, there's just the naturalistic world that people represent in common. At the same time, it can be infused with a second layer of representation of the supernatural. And the key point is that that second layer is just as imagining is not processed in the same way as factual beliefs in people's minds, that religious credence layer, that's a term of art that I introduced, is also not processed in the same way as ordinary factual belief. And the structural difference between imagining and factual belief is replicated in the structural difference between religious credence and factual belief.
By the way, I'm just curious here. You used the phrase "tome of art." Is this like a philosophical terminology? I don't quite understand. Maybe
Yeah, so I use the term. Which term?
when you said "tome of art."
Term of art. Yeah, a term of art is just when you introduce a word in order to have something that's not ambiguous. All right.
Okay.
So for example, the word belief and believe, it can be ambiguous between all sorts of different things. So for example, one of my improv teachers, I used to do improv comedy for a little bit. He would say, when you imagine the environment, you have to believe the environment. And so when you're imagining all, like a desk on the stage, even though there's no desk there, and you're imagining a cocktail bar on the stage, you have to move around the stage acting like all that stuff is really there. And he was using the word believe for that. Okay. And what he meant by it was like, just imagine it really seriously and stick to it. Okay. And then, but believe can also refer to our ordinary way of relating to ideas that we take for knowledge, right? We believe things. So believing can be what seems like knowledge to us. So the word believe can refer to all sorts of different things. So if we're to keep clear on what the differences are, we have to introduce new terms, right? And that's why sometimes jargon is necessary. So term of art is a way of saying, hey, I've introduced some new jargon so that we're not relying on everyday language that's ambiguous between very different things. All right. And so that's why I have these terms of art in my book, religious credence and factual belief. Because if you just said the everyday English word believe, it would be ambiguous between them.
And this leads into something that I think we need to get out of the way, and would be good to get out of the way from the get-go, because it might be a knee-jerk reaction that people might have to, the theory you've just outlined. And indeed, it's an objection that you respond to in the book, which is people just might respond, well, we don't call it imagining, we call it believing. We say we believe in God.
And it seems like here belief is used in a very special kind of way, or at least in a way that's distinct from the way it's used in philosophy as a kind of attitude, for example. And this is why you, I think, use the expression factual belief. So can you
Yeah.
kind of address this?
Yeah, that's right. So there's a whole lot of rabbit holes we can go down, linguistic and otherwise, but I'll sort of just cut to the chase. So philosophers tend to use the word believe and belief for what I call factual belief. All right. And it's in that formula that we, as philosophers use often, even though we all know it's problematic, that knowledge is justified true belief. All right. So, in that sense, in this sort of epistemological way to use the word belief, it's like a component that knowledge and error have in common. Okay. So, that's a very cognitive kind of sense of the word believe. All right. But I think everyday people, when they use the word believe, they use it more in the sense of have faith or have trust in, which is a very different kind of mental state. So I remember having, a living room conversation with one of my parents' friends, and they were asking me about my views. And one said, when I hear the word believe, I think of faith. And so that's a different way of using the word believe from Neil believes that there are books on his shelf. Okay. So if you use the word believe the way philosophers tend to use it, then you might think that when people say they religiously believe stuff, they're doing something different than what they're actually doing. They're having a mundane, sort of ordinary, matter of fact attitude. So this is why it's necessary to introduce these terms that distinguish the different things that fall under one word in everyday language. Right. So I'm not sure if I'm totally getting at your question. But if you say, for example, Van Leeuwen says that religious people don't believe what they say they believe, it's trading on an equivocation or an ambiguity on the everyday word believe. And if you just look at what people are doing, you see that when people are religiously believing that, say, there are gods, there's a God and there are demons and angels, and what they're doing when they just believe that they left the garage door open, those are different things. All right. And I think actually people can be intuitively aware of the difference if you prompt them to. And I've done some linguistic studies together with Tanya Lerman, who I guess you've had on, to show that people are actually aware of that difference. So I don't know if that was that kind of helpful in sorting
Yeah,
out
that
the
was
question. Yeah.
that's what I was getting at. Yeah, yeah. Exactly. Thanks. Yeah, so now we can kind of move on to the main argument for the theory you've just outlined, which is that basically factual beliefs have some properties that religious credences don't. So what are these four properties that are typical of factual belief?
Yeah. So one, and let's just get on the table an example of a perfectly ordinary factual belief. So all of us factually believe that New York City is in the state of New York. All right. So that's part of our mundane, ordinary representation of just we take the world to be like that. All right. And lots of us would call that knowledge, and it is. But the attitude that we have in that case can also be held in relation to mistaken ideas, right? So that's what we're focusing on, the attitude we have to what seems to be knowledge to us. So take the factual belief that we all have that New York City is in New York State. Okay, first characteristic, which I think is very important, is that it's involuntary. You didn't just choose to believe it. And if I offered you $1 million, I don't got $1 million to give. But even if I did, and I said, hey, Jay, I'll give you $1 million to believe that New York City is in Quebec. And we'll put you on a lie detector test afterward. And I'm going to ask you if New York is in Quebec. And if you can say New York is in Quebec and pass the lie detector test, you get the $1 million. I mean, unless you could maybe act, and if you could control yourself in the right way, maybe you could pass the test, but you wouldn't actually believe in this matter-of-fact way that New York City is in Quebec. So your ordinary factual beliefs about the world are, in a very important sense, the things that you're stuck with given the evidence that you've cognized. So if you think the supermarket is open and then you drive by and you see that the open sign is unlit, then your belief updates. All right. If you think there are almonds in the cupboard and you look and see an empty cupboard, or you hear from your partner that we're out of almonds, your belief updates. So factual beliefs are responsive, and I'll go a little bit out of order, are responsive to evidence rather than the will. All right. So the second property we can focus on is what I call vulnerability to evidence. So first, your factual beliefs are involuntary, and second, they're controlled by evidence. All right. And the key thing to note, and people say, oh, but people are irrational, they go against the evidence all the time. But that's against the background of how well things work. Any learning we do, learning to drive a car, learning to use a computer, learning the lay of a new city that we go to, learning how to order food in a different language, all of that involves updating factual beliefs in response to evidence. And normally it works so well that we just don't notice it. And we focus on the interesting cases, like religious so-called belief, that go against the grain of this evidence responsiveness. All right. Now, the other thing that we can say, and this is getting a little more technical, but the factual beliefs we have about the world provide a layer of representation that is effectively always on whenever we're acting. Okay. And even when we're playing pretend, our factual beliefs are guiding our behavior. So the child doesn't, as it were, forget that the G.I. Joe toy is made of plastic. All right. And the actor on the stage doesn't forget that there's a trap door to not fall through. Or if it does, if the actor does, it's a big mistake. The actor doesn't forget to project to the audience, even though he's playing Macbeth. Okay. So whenever we're acting, we're using factual beliefs. So this is the third property that I want to mention, which is they're uncompartmentalized. Right? Every day of the week, we behave as if electricity is real. And even when we're placed without electricity, it's not relevant. But, if it were to be a situation where electricity could be used, we would still use that factual belief. So our factual beliefs are continuously and thoroughgoingly action guiding in a way that imaginings aren't. Okay. So just to flip to the other side of the coin, imaginings are voluntary. We can choose to imagine a monkey in the kitchen. And imaginings aren't vulnerable to evidence because we can imagine the monkey contrary to the evidence of our eyes. And then contrary-wise, imaginings are compartmentalized. They tend to guide behavior in make-believe settings. Okay. But then they're not guiding behavior when we're not playing make-believe or doing some form of practice or engaged in deception. All right. So factual beliefs are uncompartmentalized versus imaginings being compartmentalized. All right. And then the third property is a bit more technical, but it's what I call cognitive governance. All right. And that just means we use our factual beliefs to guide our inferences among other ideas and attitudes like imaginings. So if you imagine, here's a simple example. If you imagine a tree being struck by lightning, the next thing you imagine is that the tree gets charred, the tree, it like catches fire or breaks or something like that. And that's because you factually believe that lightning is hot, and you factually believe that wood burns, and so on. So your background factual beliefs guide the inferences in your imagination. All right. But imaginings don't do that for factual belief. So that's a sort of asymmetric relation. Okay. So this gives us a bit of an idea about, how we treat that idea that New York City is in New York State, right? It's involuntary that we factually believe it. It's responsive to evidence. It's uncompartmentalized. Whenever it's relevant, we'll use it in guiding our behavior. And then it has this property of cognitive governance. So the key thing is just like imagining differs from factual belief on all four of those crucial properties. So too, the evidence I think shows does a lot of religious belief. So people talk about choosing to believe. All right. And in various cultures, we see things like syncretism, where people pick and choose elements of one religion or another religion to combine into one religion. And that's very much a voluntary sort of choice. We also note that people tend to act on their religious quote unquote beliefs and in sacred times and in sacred spaces, but often, as Tanya Lerman puts it, they forget about God outside of the sacred day of the week or outside of the sacred times and sacred spaces. Or they might have rituals peppered throughout the day where the religious credences become active. But, again, referring back to Tanya Lerman, she often says people don't pray for God to feed their dog, right? So when it comes to the ordinary, mundane things of the world, say you're away from home, you might call your next door neighbor and hope your next door neighbor can make it over. But why not call God? Okay, that's because religious credences are compartmentalized to the sacred practical setting. Um, and then also, oftentimes, what we say we religiously believe, it doesn't impact our ordinary representation of the world, which shows that the religious beliefs don't have cognitive governance in the same way that factual beliefs do.
Mm. I guess, yeah, these are very interesting points. And I was wondering um, about the first property, which you defined as you choose which religious beliefs
Mhm.
to believe in. Um, I was wondering how categorical you take these properties to be. Is it the case that, religious beliefs really don't have these properties, or do you have a more gradient view where it's like, oh, maybe it is the case that on average, religious beliefs
Mhm.
differ from this? Because it also depends on how you define the word voluntary, right? Like an
Yeah.
anthropologist might say something like, well, the mind is predisposed in times of uncertainty to have a superstitious psychology. And therefore, in
Sure.
some way, you you're not voluntarily choosing a religious explanation. Sure, you are choosing which type of explanation you choose to believe in, but the mind on some level is subautomatic and sort of ensuring that religious beliefs still are active in the culture.
Yeah, sure. So great questions. So on the first one, we have to just go back and keep in mind the attitude content distinction. So really what I'm doing is I'm positing different ways of relating to ideas, right? So I'm positing factual belief. Okay, everyone thinks there's that unless you're a crazy behaviorist. Okay. But then there's a different way of relating to ideas, religious credence. Now here's the part where people get tripped up a little bit. Um, in principle, it's possible to have a factual belief attitude towards supernatural ideas. Okay. And maybe that's what it was like for me when I was a little kid. So I'm not religious anymore, but when I was a little kid, maybe I just straightforwardly thought that there was this guy named God. Okay. And so, that there is God is something that I factually believed. But I think what most people have, right, and we can debate how wide the application of the theory is. When it comes to the question of God is real, people have a religious credence attitude. So one of the I think one of the positive things about my theory is that it allows the flexibility to say, hey, there can be religious credence towards religious ideas, but in some case there might also be factual beliefs. Okay. And just to illustrate a related point, um, I once was listening to an interview with the cognitive scientist of religion, Ingela Visuri, who worked on spirituality among people on the autism spectrum. And she mentioned that one of her informants, this is very interesting, had straightforwardly factually believed until he was about 17 that there were unicorns. Okay. And you can kind of see how that would happen. There might be you hear talk about lions. So as a kid, you think there are lions. You hear talk about giraffes. So as a kid, you think there are giraffes. You hear talk about a unicorn, and maybe if you're on the spectrum, you don't pick up on the pretending cues. So you just think, okay, there's also this. So just as most people imagine that there are unicorns as opposed to factually believing it, it's in principle possible to factually believe it. Okay. So this is to circle around, even if most people religiously creed their religious stories and doctrines, it's my theory has the flexibility to say, yeah, in some cases people might factually believe that. And it's going to be an empirical question, which is going on in any given case. And in the cases that I look at, the evidence seems to be like, yeah, this is more people having this imaginative sort of attitude to religious stories and doctrines rather than factual belief. Okay, all that said, between imagining and religious credence and all these more voluntary attitudes, which I call secondary cognitive attitudes, is voluntariness, as you put it, a matter of degree or a matter of kind? And I would say it's a little bit more lumpy than that. All right. So I think that to the extent that religious credence can be involuntary, I think the psychological pressures in that direction are very different from the kind of involuntariness that attends our factual beliefs. All right. Here's a comparison. Factual beliefs, the formation of them in response to evidence, it's sort of like digestion. You can't say, oh, I'm going to digest faster or slower. It just happens. All right. Whereas with religious credence, it's more like speaking an oath or saying a promise. And even if you feel compelled to do it, it's still in some way responsive to the will. So the kind of, people do sometimes object to my theory. They say, oh, I felt social pressure, like I really had to embrace this religious credence. And my response would be, you can use the word involuntary for that if you like, but it's not involuntariness in the same way that digestion or factual belief are involuntary. All right. There might be a felt need to embrace certain religious ideas, but that need is sort of a matter of deep internal motivation rather than you just can't help yourself. All right. You go to the supermarket and the open sign is unlit. Poof, you can't help but just forming that different factual belief. Whereas even when there's a lot of pressure, either external social pressure to form certain religious credences, you still at some level can take it or leave it.
Hmm.
It's
I
as
don't,
a technical terms, it's responsive to utility in technical psychological terms. I can see you got an objection ruminating, so let's hear it.
well, I guess like the way you sort of defined involuntariness for social pressure, I kind of get that there's a word game there, but then I suppose like I think the thought experiment would be something like this, right? If I created 10 different islands of 10 different societies, do all of those 10 societies come up with religious beliefs? And sure, there might be individual differences in
Mhm.
terms of who accepts it or not. But the very fact that all of those 10 societies come up with some sort of religious belief to me is akin to sort of, the psychological drive to feel hunger, in that there's a psychological need to sort of
Yeah.
satisfy
Yeah, yeah.
uncertainty. And
Mhm.
like hunger is a really good example because it's again like it's not like a voluntary drive. It's sort of like a byproduct of evolution. And in the
Right.
same way,
Yeah.
you could have, and okay, like there can be word games around whether it's religious credence, but you do see like new kinds of neo-religions that keep coming up.
Mhm. Mhm.
And on some level, to me, it seems that's involuntary at the psychological level in the same sense that you think of hunger as a psychological drive.
Yeah, yeah. So there may be an involuntary in a lot of people psychological urge to do religious type stuff. Um, but that doesn't mean that the particulars of the religious stuff you do, and in particular, the particulars of the religious credences you have are are voluntary,
Sure,
are not
sure,
voluntary.
sure, sure.
Okay. Just to respond to your example, or your two examples, so the islands and the hunger, um, the islands will also have, if it's normal humans, which we're assuming here, uh, people playing make believe on them. So
Mhm,
kids playing games of make believe, more simple or more complex. A child will pretend to be a hunter or pretend to be an animal or something like that. And so children have deep psychological urges to play games and to play games of make believe. Um, but that illustrates 3 points. One, at what time they do it is very
mhm,
much subject to the will. Okay, so that just shows that imagining, and its efficacy in guiding play is subject to the will. It's voluntary. So it's like you may be stuck with the urges, right? And that may be just something about us as creatures. We're stuck with these urges to play games and play games of make believe. But the games which games we play, it can still be a matter of
mhm,
choice. It'd be okay. Let's play the Tigers game, or let's play the Hunters game. All right. And we can choose which one. And as kids, just feeling that urge to play make believe, that urge can be satisfied in different ways. Okay. And people will do that with religion, right? So if we look at, say, the time of the Inquisition, say in Portugal, and there were a lot of conversos, a lot of people really did convert under the pressure of the
mhm,
Inquisition. All right. Was that voluntary? In the relevant sense, yes, because it was, subject to a certain utility. All right. It was okay, convert or die. It's still a choice. You can choose to convert. All right. So lots of things are involuntary in the sense of you have such a compelling motivation, but the point I'm making about digestion and about ordinary factual beliefs is that they're not even subject to motivation, right? It might be subject to motivation in the sense of which dictionary or which encyclopedia you just decide to open, but once the evidence is before you and it's solidly there, you can't just choose to factually believe. I mean, say there was an inquisition now that would, put to death anyone who was found to believe that New York City was anywhere other than Quebec, right? Now, we're rational here, so we would pretend our asses off, right? Oh yeah,
mhm,
it's who thinks it's outside Quebec? There are people like that, but we would be pretending. We couldn't actually get ourselves to factually believe that. And that's just a difference
mhm.
between religious creeds and factual belief. And the fact that it's a matter of choice, I think, is a very important and compelling difference that we have to keep track of.
Hmm.
Fab.
Yeah, something I found really great about your answer is we realized that actually taking like real examples really makes make believe and religious credence a lot more vivid and understandable. And indeed, what I love about the book more generally is that not only do you have this kind of cool, very like typical technical philosophical framework, but you do lots of work to apply it, to make it do some work, and you look at lots of evidence. Um, so maybe can you talk about some more evidence, because I think
Yeah,
this stuff is really cool.
I'll just sketch my strategy. So just to reorient listeners, there's a theoretical philosophical part where I draw these distinctions. So factual beliefs are involuntary, they're responsive to evidence or vulnerable to evidence. they're uncompartmentalized, and they have cognitive governance, right? And the secondary cognitive attitudes, including imagining, don't have those properties. So important difference. Okay, once you have that framework in place, you're absolutely right, Jay, that there needs to be some empirical evidence on the table to say, where do these so-called religious beliefs fall? So my evidential strategy is to do, in chapter 3, a sort of in-depth case study. And there I use ethnographies of the Vineyard Church. And then in chapter 4, I get more historical and more cross-cultural, and cast a much broader net and look at different places and times that give some evidence that many religious beliefs, at least, have the more secondary kind of cognitive attitude properties. So just going through it with the Vineyard Church, again, relying on Tanya Luhrmann's ethnography, When God Talks Back, of the Vineyard. And then also one that's not as well known, John Bialeski, another anthropologist, wrote a ethnography of the Vineyard called A Diagram for Fire. So I really got into trying to understand this evangelical church. So it's fairly representative of American evangelicalism. So to go through the properties, first of all, people in the Vineyard often talk about choosing to believe. So they have this practice of hearing the voice of God, and that's where they have something like auditory mental imagery, and they have a framework for discerning whether it's the voice of God. Does it give them the feeling of peace? Does it cohere with things in Scripture? Is it somewhat surprising? Is it something they would have thought anyway? All right. But here's an interesting thing. A lot of them joke that it could be the voice of God, or it could just be the pizza they ate for lunch, or it could be the voice of God, or it could be the burrito they ate for lunch. And they know that. These are close to direct quotes from Tanya's book. And so what that suggests is they're making a voluntary choice to cast it one way or another. All right. Is this auditory mental imagery that I'm having going to be God, or is it going to be just something that happened to well up inside me? And the fact that it's a choice is it's not only that it's a choice, it's that they're aware it's a choice. That's so compelling. So that's just one example of religious belief being voluntary. And then for the compartmentalized part, there's a phrase, I don't know if you have it over in the UK, but in the States it's relatively common: once a week Christians. All right, where they're Christian on Sunday and not most of the rest of the week. And the truth is, I think most Christians are something like that, and the ethnographic record, at least of the Vineyard Church, shows that tendency. And often people will bemoan the fact that they, as it were, forget about God the rest of the week, or when it's not their prayer time, or when it's not Sunday, they'll fail to act as if God was actually there. God was actually watching. A little bit more of an irreverent joke, this time from Dan Dennett's Breaking the Spell. Dan says, people do things with God watching that they wouldn't do with their own mothers watching. Okay, and it's in a lot of your week, when it's not Sunday, you're just acting as if God is not even there. So that's the compartmentalization. And I think a good explanation for the compartmentalization is that religious credence is compartmentalized, and it works kind of like, okay, we do this sacralized make-believe play on Sundays, and then the rest of the week it's about getting our dishes washed. It's about earning our paycheck. It's about getting to the gym before it closes, and so on. And in that case, as Bialeski puts it, the sort of vineyard diagram, or the vineyard frame, it collapses, and it's as if there's just a naturalistic world. Okay, much like, once the play is over, you're not Macbeth anymore. All right. You're a guy in line at the bar trying to order a beer. Okay, the Macbeth goes away. Even if you're still having Macbeth imaginings, you're not you're not worried that the the bartender suspects you of having killed the king. All right, because it collapses away. So the religious credences, I skipped over invulnerable to evidence. I think that one's fairly straightforward. I mean, people often say the point of faith is to believe without evidence. All right,
Mm,
so
mm,
there I'm just taking many people at their words. It's a little bit more complicated to parse out what's going on with a religious apologetics. I've something to say there, but for most people, it's the religious faith isn't about responsiveness to evidence. Unlike factual belief. Um, and then just going to say some evidence for why is it that religious credence doesn't have cognitive governance. There's a really good study, I think, by Justin Barrett from the early 2000s, where he looks at what people pray for. All right. And just to summarize it, people tend to pray for things that had a good chance of happening anyway. All right. So, for example, someone in a boat and there's a leak in the boat, they might pray for um, a, a captain to choose to steer a ship closer, or they might pray for the strength to row faster to get to the shore. Okay, so they're praying. So you might think, oh, they just straightforwardly factually believe God is there, but they don't just pray for God to plug the leak in the boat. All right, they don't pray for that which they know wouldn't be
mm,
within the realm of naturalistic possibility. But why not? Well, my explanation for that is the religious credence map layer doesn't cognitively govern the factual belief map layer. All right. So kind of when people are praying, it's for stuff that's left open by their factual beliefs, but they don't assume that uh, um, God will just come down and alter the natural world, which is in their minds represented by their factual beliefs. So that's just a quick illustration of the lack of cognitive governance on the part of religious
mm,
credences.
mm.
All
Yeah, I'm
right.
curious.
By the way, let me
Just
just say,
mm,
there's this is the sort of evidence where there's going to be lots of exceptions to people act weird. Mostly people don't pray for amputated limbs to grow back, but some people do. All right, but we're talking about general patterns here, and I think the pattern does tend to show lack of cognitive governance on the part of religious credences. Right. Sorry, I
yeah,
didn't mean to cut you off, but go ahead.
oh, no, no problem. Yeah, I'm curious because you mentioned apologetics, and you said you maybe had a bit of a story. I'm wondering what you would say about that. Are they engaged in some kind of intellectual game?
Yes,
Okay.
you nailed it.
One short answer.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, it's I mean, sounds like you can tell me the view. But when you look at serious biblical scholars, they're responding, they're trying to figure out the text of the Bible, what it was doing in that time. They're learning the languages, they're making, comparisons with the archaeology, and there's if it's done right, there's a fundamental openness to the possibility that the views expressed in this text are extremely foreign and perhaps objectionable to what we would think is okay today. But religious apologists are kind of like, you know, uh, lawyers for the idea that, oh, this is all going to come out true, right? And they're in effect thus putting on a performance, right, where they're not really responsive to evidence, right? They're rather trying to take the Bible as a prop in a game that portrays it as the inerrant truth or whatever it is they're doing apologetics for. All right. So the sort of veneer of responsiveness to evidence is only that, right? So it's sort of they're pretending to be responsive to evidence, but not actually being so. And I have a paper called from a while ago called "Do Religious Beliefs Respond to Evidence," where I address this issue, right? So there is in certain kind of circles of religious apologetics, or maybe that's just what religious apologetics is. There is this sort of playing at responding to evidence, but it's not really there, right? They'll use the props how they need to use it to spin the Bible as coming out something that we can and should accept here and now. But it's not actually an openness to revision like we see with factual beliefs.
So I'm also curious, like, what you do about like meta debates about this that people might have. So I don't. Let's just take a somewhat famous example. I'll try and explain it quite briefly, but famously Ibn Sina conserved Aristotle and translated him and interpreted the
Yeah, yeah.
metaphysics. Basically, Aristotle wrote a bunch of stuff about like what the nature of being is, how the world is, and
Yeah.
Ibn Sina was really interested in this and did a lot of work on it. And then later, Ibn Sina's commentaries arrived into Europe, and then people, notably Thomas Aquinas, rejected the whole wave that Ibn Sina saw, like the metaphysics, because Ibn Sina was saying, essentially, like we don't, like, although Aristotle's a pagan, we can just like interpret the metaphysics, and then because he's saying the truth, it'll align with what like the holy texts say, right? And then Thomas Aquinas said, no, we have to interpret it through the lens of the Bible. And that's a kind of like meta debate about like, should we do apologetics or not? So I feel like if you hold this view about apologetics, it also infects like what you're going to say about these meta debates. Like, what are they actually debating? Are they saying like, should we be responsive to evidence, or are they debating something else?
Yeah. So let me just first say for the audience something that I think is fairly common sense in cognitive science of religion. But those people are not representative of ordinary lay religious belief, right? So the abstruse philosophy and theology, I mean, it can be very interesting, but just wanted to put a pin in that to say, we have to be wary of saying, let's say that Aquinas doesn't fit my theory, right? Okay, right. I mean, he's extremely rare. That said, what I want to say about the whole realm you're talking about of theology, um, is that I think speculative theorizing is also not a matter of ordinary factual belief. All right. So in various academic disciplines, we construct these speculative theories, and y- you know we have a sort of hypothetical attitude towards them. All right. So it's kind of like, look, people in philosophy will write about free will for their entire careers, but then if you woke them up in the middle of the night and shook them and asked them, well, do you know that your theory is true? Like, no, this is just what I'm advocating, and things like that. So with the, I'm not getting into the details of your question exactly, but when it comes to highly theoretical, theology and exegesis, and especially the methodology of theology, um, I think what's going on in most philosophers and theologians is that there is a sort of, speculative theoretical game being played often over the course of their careers. Um, and that's also not the same thing. It might not be the same thing as religious credence, right? Because it's a more academic type secondary cognitive attitude, but it's certainly not the same thing as our ordinary factual beliefs about the world. Now, there can be a crossover. Like, I think over the course of the history of physics, things that have been highly speculative are now just factually believed, but that's because they've been eventually confirmed by experimentation. But in the realm of abstruse theology, there's no analog of the experiments that would actually confirm the abstruse theory. All right. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but I do think not just with theologians, but with metaphysics in general, people are playing a sort of compartmentalized game. And by the way, let me just say, none of this is to denigrate that, right? I'm giving a descriptive psychological theory of what's
Mm.
going on. So just to forestall that sort of maybe response that some people might have, like, oh, Van Leeuwen is using game in a sort of pejorative way. And the answer is no, not necessarily. It could be good or it could be bad. I think acting and make believe, I think it's all just wonderful. I think it's wonderful that kids do it. So where it gets dangerous is when you start casting your religious credences or your make believe type attitudes as if they were factual beliefs, right? So that's the sort of thing that maybe my entire life I've
Mm.
been bothered by.
Mm.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, at first it seemed like your answer was just going to be, well, these guys are a bunch of dweebs, so we don't care. But actually, just so I
No, no,
understand.
no. I guess I mean now we're gonna we might open the Pandora's box of admiration and scorn I have for various figures. But I certainly don't think Aquinas is a dweeb. I do think he's doing something very different from what your ordinary huckster religious apologists do. All right. So he's a serious metaphysician. And I think his 5 proofs of the existence of God. I mean, I'm not an Aquinas scholar, so someone in the comments section call me out and tell me I got it completely wrong. But I think partly what these proofs are doing is they're also implicitly defining what the target notion is, right? The God is that which satisfies the theoretical roles detailed in these arguments, and that kind of metaphysical theorizing, I don't know if it has any chance of ultimately being confirmed or disconfirmed, but it's a serious form of thinking which I think is different in nature from religious apologetics
Yeah, so
in
so
important ways.
so just so I guess we can move on after this, but just so I can see if I understood your answer, like my question is, well, look, there's these debates that are like higher order about like, okay, does like metaphysical theorizing or whatnot about like how the world is, does it have to follow religious belief or is it the other way around, right? And I'm saying, don't you have to say something about that? And you say, well, no, because in the end, metaphysical debates, these are also compartmentalized, so it's all fine, basically.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, more or less, I think that's about right. I think with metaphysical theorizing, you're always going to be taking a certain leap towards an assumption that isn't really grounded in your empirical experience, right? And then you're kind of constructing a theory with that stake in outer space, to use a sort of um strange metaphor. All right. And I think when you look at the philosophy in the Christian Middle Ages, a lot of what theorists were doing was saying, okay, we're going to take our stakes be the theological ideas that are either canonical or orthodox or something like that. But then we're going to do our metaphysical theorizing on the basis of that, right? And yeah, I think that theorizing is also different from ordinary religious belief. So I think is that tracking what you thought I was saying?
I think so.
Yeah.
Hmm.
so now that we have, like covered the evidence and we've also like covered like some of the basic terminology, it might be good to come back to something you teased in the introduction of the episode, which
Hmm.
was that while religious credence or belief might be a kind of make believe, it still differs from imagining in other contexts because it has an important social function. So,
Hmm.
could you maybe sort of clarify what this function is and how acknowledging it helps us better to understand the features of religious belief?
Yeah. So this is one where I think the difference actually is more a matter of degree than a matter of kind. So I mentioned in the beginning that games of make believe can form in groups. All right. Well, if you make it really strongly define in-groups, right, and be a requirement of an in-group that you play this game of make-believe, then you're kind of adding group identity constitution to a certain imagining. All right. So take uh quote unquote belief in the resurrection. All right. So that is a religious credence, not a factual belief. So it's different from mere imagining in that unless you hold this religious credence, you don't get to belong to many, many churches. All right. You don't get to call yourself a Christian. So the thing that sort of by degree, but not by kind, distinguishes religious credence from ordinary games of make believe, where you imagine you're a tiger or whatever, is that it plays this role in constituting which in group you're a part of, right? So it's a willingness to engage in the proper actions that are expressive of this sacralized imagining that makes you a member of the Vineyard Church or a member of whatever religion it is that you happen to belong to. So that's one difference between what we might call mere imagining and religious credence. And the other thing is, and relatedly, is that religious credences, the map layer they provide of the things in the world, it categorizes things as being objects of sacred value. All right. And sacred valuing is something that humans do. It's been studied by psychologists like, Philip Tetlock, anthropologists like Scott Atran. And it's a different way of valuing things from our ordinary utilitarian valuing. All right. So to get a sense of what ordinary utilitarian valuing is, just think, okay, take a pair of sneakers you'd really like to have. Is it really worth 5 months of Netflix subscription? Right? You can say, well, yeah, maybe it's not worth that, right? So you can trade stuff off. That's ordinary utilitarian valuing. All right. Would if you were religious, would you let someone use a sacred book of yours as a doorstop? Right? No, right? That's sacred valuing. All right. So what religious credences do is they kind of, even though they're an imaginative map layer, they end up marking objects, events, entities, and actions in the world as something that the sacred value system can attach to. All right. So if something becomes religiously created to be an object that was touched by a holy figure, then my sacred valuing attaches to that object. All right. So that's one thing that ordinary imaginings don't really do in the same way. Ordinary imaginings don't connect up our valuing, our sacralized valuing with objects and entities in the world, and just go to any religious center like a temple or a mosque or a church of any sort, and there are going to be lots of things in there that you wouldn't just treat in the ordinary expendable utilitarian type way. All right. And that's because, well, not only just respect for the people who have those sacred values, but it's, for the people themselves, they have those sacred values because their religious credences have like laid over their factual beliefs like a sort of transparency and marked things in the world as being objects of sacred value. So that's the two ways. Those are the two ways that even though cognitively religious credences function very much like imaginings, the fact that those two elements are added to them, the group identity and the sacred values connection, that's what makes them distinct as a kind. And that's why they seem so much more serious than the ordinary imaginings behind make-believe play.
Yeah, nice. So I guess we're nearing the end now because you've covered quite a lot of ground, but there's a few less questions be good to ask. And one is, I know the whole idea behind the book seems fairly controversial. Right? Just going up to someone who outwardly believes, in God and saying, well, actually, you're just imagining it. Like they might get hurt or mad or just ignore you. So has this book been controversial? And I guess this is actually two questions. Like, has it been controversial? How controversial has it been inside of academic circles where these things are debated? Like, have people rejected it a lot, or like engage a lot with the book in a critical way? And then second, like, has it been controversial outside of academic debate?
Well, let me point to one thing you said a minute ago. If you said to someone, "You're just imagining it." Now, what I object to there is the word "just," because it seems to, and that's not my theory. Wouldn't license use of that word there, right?
Mm.
It's imagining it in a way that is of deep value to you, right? And so try saying that again in a way that's more true to my theory. If I go to a religious person and say, well, what your religious beliefs are is you're imagining a divine reality, and this imagining is of deep value to you, right? So it doesn't have, one, that's more accurate to my theory, and
Mm.
two, it doesn't have this pejorative dismissive sense. So
It
the
still
kind of
sounds a bit. It
mm,
still sounds
yeah,
like it could be hurtful, though,
yeah.
in a different
Well,
way, maybe.
I have had these conversations, and like my family is still very religious, and lots of my parents' friends are, and then also other religious people. And when you posit the thesis in a way that is, doesn't make it out to be like trite or trivial, usually the reaction is a sort of interest, maybe a little bit of wariness. But one thing two responses I've gotten from religious interlocutors, and this is just me talking to people, two responses I've gotten have been, well, we have to do that. Right. That's one, right? Well, that's we have to do that to feel we have meaningful lives. And that response, it kind of tacitly acknowledges that I'm on to something. Okay. Um, and then and then a second response is, yes, well, atheists do that too. And to which I say, yeah, that seems reasonable to me. Again, this attitude of religious credence can be taken in relation to variable contents. All right. So whatever is sacred to you, you might be engaged in this sort of sacralizing game of make-believe play. So that's actually an extension of my theory, that if the evidence falls in place, that may also be true. So I suppose if I were to talk to some people, probably religious apologists, they'd say, "Oh, that's not what we're doing. We just factually believe it." But that's the reactions I've gotten in conversations from people that I know to be religiously committed haven't been uh, uh, outright denial of the view, and they haven't gotten overtly offended. Now, of course, you got to choose your words carefully, and so on. And then, just in terms of like the mail, the email messages I've gotten from people, I haven't gotten any hate mail so far.
Hmm.
Right, so
Oh wow.
knock on wood, a little bit of superstition. I've gotten a fair bit of complimentary emails, and maybe that just shows people are nicer than we think. Okay. But people who bother to listen to my interviews or bother to read the book, at least think that it offers something valuable. So that's kind of lay reception. Gosh, you could I don't know. I haven't read all the YouTube comments on the
But
interviews
yeah,
on
don't
the
do
interviews that
that.
I've gotten.
Just don't.
Who knows? I mean, but I've read some of them, and usually it seems not too bad. In academic spheres, the book has been controversial. There's a symposium on the book out in the journal Religion, Brain, and Behavior right now, and I think it's something like 7 commentators that I respond to. or it's not an issue yet, but it's online first, right? And some people overtly say that they agree with my position. Others have kind of criticisms and reservations. So it's been controversial in a fairly gratifying way. I will say, going back to the word belief, a lot of the criticisms rest on what I think is equivocation on the word belief, right? So the criticism goes something like, well, Neil says religious people don't believe what they say they believe, and I think they do believe it, right? And that's just what that's doing is it's just replicating the ambiguity that I seek to dispel. All right. In one sense, yes, they're believing it. Period. Right. If you understand uh the word believe to refer to religious credence, then yes, they're believing it. So I think there's a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, I think, in philosophical circles that wants to treat the word believe as just a sort of having a unified, uh, simple meaning. And once you get rid of that assumption, then it becomes an open question. What attitudes do people have in the everyday humdrum empirical context versus what attitudes they have are become operative in religious sacralized context? And then you see, if you don't just get kind of have the wool pulled over your eyes by the word believe, you would say, hey, people are doing different things with their ideas in these different contexts, and we should have terms of art or words to track that, and that's why I introduce factual belief and religious credence.
Cool. So I think this might be a good time to wrap things up. So before we sort of do that, is there anything during the episode that you'd want to further clarify, mention, or discuss a tiny bit more if you feel like we didn't do a good job at covering some of those aspects or they could have been dwelled into more deeply?
Gosh, there's so many there's so many things.
So many holes to poke.
Yeah. Or opportunity, open doors for
Mhm.
exploration. But I think I'll leave it at that. It feels like we covered some good ground. And so yeah, I really appreciate it.
Hmm. And something we ask all our guests is if you have a recommendation of a piece of media that can either be directly about the topic or something that illustrates the topic, anything like a film, a novel,
Yeah.
anything, a
Yeah.
song.
I think a very good recent film is Conclave, and it's about the choosing of the next pope. And it came out, I think, a couple of years ago at this point. Um, and what you see in that movie is something very interesting. These are all cardinals, the highest level of the Catholic Church. And you see that most of them, in their intrigues and political infighting about who would be the next pope, it's like God is the furthest thing from their mind. Now, there are a couple characters in the film who it's sort of like God is before their eyes continually, but there's all this strategizing and intriguing and counting potential votes and so on, and trying to choose which potential pope to support on the basis of very kind of practical, very human considerations. And what's striking about that is just the compartmentalization of religious credence. When they're trying to solve this political problem of which potential pope to support, they're they're counting votes, they're looking at political lean, they're looking at who will be more acceptable. And the question of, well, what is God wanting in all of this is sort of set by the side, even as they wear these sacred robes and even as they're in conclave. So I think that film, at least most of the characters in that film, I think it illustrates the kind of psychological compartmentalization that attends religious credences in a very powerful way. And it feels realistic. right? Maybe someone someone who's actually been in the Conclave can correct me, right? But it was a pretty impressive film, and it's very entertaining as well. So that's one I'll recommend to the audience.
Ooh,
Fantastic. Thanks. Yes, this has been Cognitations. We've been chatting with Neil van Leeuwen. Thanks a lot.
thanks so much.
It's my pleasure. And if I could ask the audience, please recommend the book to your local public library or university library. That way as many people can have access to it as possible.
I do have to say it's really nice to read, and it was kind of surprising, like the prologue and the epilogue with the parable of the playground. A very original piece of philosophical writing. Really great.
Well, thank you very much.